So nerf Zyra. Zyra's actually on the buff list too. Maybe I should cut it though, but Zyra's on the buff list right now. Here, you ready? Ready? Pay attention. Singe nerf, Steb buff, Trundle buff, Zyra buff, Camille buff, Leona buff, Rel buff, Renata nerf, Set buff, Zeri buff, Ziggs nerf, Cassio buff, Ezreal buff, Gangplank melee buff, Loris buff, Nunu buff, Rennie buff, Smeech buff, Twisted Fate buff, Ambessa buff, Echo buff, Elise range buff, Twitch buff, Vibe buff, Jace melee buff, LeBlanc buff, Mel buff, Victor buff, Warwick buff, Automata nerf, Chembear nerf, Scrap buff, Artillerist buff, Sorcerer buff, Deathblade buff, Even Shroud buff, Ionic Spark buff, Fruitance Hurricane buff. And that's not final, to be clear. To be clear, that's not final. None of that is final. That's all pre-data. That's my notes. So...